Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. We've seen some huge global turmoil across the world so far in 2022, and things seem to be getting worse before they get better. Of course, at the start of the year, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine moving forward, and although we continue to see that conflict persist and the challenges that it's providing to the global economy move forward, a new and, in a sense, more worrying trend is starting to emerge as China undergoes further limitations in its economic output with another outbreak of COVID-19. Important to remember here that COVID-19 in China is quite different from the rest of the world. The rest of the world getting on with life a little bit more, high levels of vaccination, starting to look at how a new normal seems to exist. But Gareth, we're seeing in China this huge focus on still a zero COVID policy. It's got Beijing and different parts of the local government apparatus quite concerned. Shanghai with 26 million people locked down, a hard lockdown that had been going on for a few weeks has now been extended indefinitely. At one point you had children, that were being split up from their families if anyone had COVID-19, risks of food shortages and similar. But also across China, we're seeing around about 200 million people that are locked down or under some sort of restrictions. There's not as much focus on economic activity, both in terms of being able to supply, China, of course, being a huge producer for the world, but also as a real rising economy, especially in the middle class, not having that same amount of demand for a bunch of products. Global dairy trade auction this week showing that slightly weaker purchasing coming out of China, contributing to a 1% fall in the GDT index. At the same time, realistically, we're not going to see Chinese tourists back anytime soon if we continue to see these lockdowns and people not being able to move out and about in China. And so the worry moving forward for New Zealand, given that China is our largest trading partner, takes a third of all of our goods trade, is really what happens there has a huge implication for the rest of the world. Now, Gareth, what does all of this mean? What do these lockdowns of 14% of the Chinese economy mean for both global growth, but possibly more importantly, the very high levels of inflation that we're already seeing?
Yes, so inflation quite problematic across the globe at the moment, and it's really a question of which is going to dominate, whether it's the sort of reduced supply coming out of China or the reduction in demand from the fact that they're locked down and their economy is sort of stuttering along as well. And my assessment of it would be that probably the supply impacts are greater, certainly for the globe as a whole, because we know there's been right around the world, developed economies have been recovering as they emerge from the Omicron outbreak and the pandemic more generally. And so demand has been strong, and we have been relying on China to provide that in terms of their manufacturing output. And obviously with lockdown and the ineffectiveness of the vaccine and the fact that they're still trying to keep COVID at zero, even amidst an Omicron outbreak, just does raise a whole lot of concerns about those sort of supply chain disruptions and the lack of product that's going to be available. So in an environment where you've got very strong demand around the world and a lack of supply coming out of China, I would probably be most concerned about the inflationary side of things in terms of what it means for product coming into New Zealand. You mentioned dairy prices being a little bit softer as an indicator maybe of a softer Chinese demand overall, but when we look at commodity prices for our exports, generally speaking, they are still at very, very good levels, and even dairy with that slight softening at very high levels indeed. So I'd be less concerned about the sort of implications for our exporters at this stage. And let's be realistic, even in a lockdown, generally speaking, you still have to eat, and for our exporters, that is primarily what we're sending over to China. So yeah, inflation probably more of a concern for me than what we're seeing in terms of the implications around our export markets going forward. I'd suggest they hold together really well, apart from, of course, that tourism that you mentioned and the inability perhaps to attract Chinese visitors back here anytime soon. And there's other concerns as well, of course, that we've got. A lot of geopolitical stuff out there with, we've seen Russia and the Ukraine and the conflict there, but that also potentially spreading through into, a bit more of a bolder Chinese approach. What's your thoughts around that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, increasingly New Zealand is going to have to look closer and closer at our interactions across the sort of more Asia-Pacific region as it is. I mean, of course, we've seen in recent times some real nervousness and concern coming from both Australia and New Zealand with the apparent moves by China to integrate greater in the Solomon Islands and have a much greater security presence, very direct security presence there. And as well as that, that there's always been wider concerns. We know that the likes of the South China Sea is still a very conflicted area, especially in a time when we talk a lot about shipping activity and similar. And just going back to your point before, Gareth, about production, I guess the big challenge as we move forward is that inflation is definitely going to be exacerbated by these current hits. And you're right that the global growth element is actually an open question, depending on how China responds to that, I guess. Is there going to be that level of support from the Chinese state to support activity? Or do you see things slacken off a bit? Because although the current economic activity growth target for China is a more sluggish 5.5%, it's their lowest in decades. It's still 5.5%, and the fact that it is so high, does give you the feeling that things are going to continue on. And in fact, Chinese workers have been sleeping on the factory floor to try and keep things going. Port movements have been trying to be redirected to those open ports. So there's definitely a feeling that things will keep up there. But I guess my wider worry when we look at that global sphere is that things are changing quite rapidly. There has been a much greater level of aggression across the globe. Of course, Russia being the dominant challenge there. But more broadly, the remnants, I guess, of COVID-19 have started to really buckle the seams of some developed countries. We know the likes of Sri Lanka at the moment, under some enormous economic turmoil, has no foreign reserves, has import costs that they just cannot pay. People are starving, people are being cut off, and I think the latest finance minister in power was in and out within 24 hours. So, the difficulty actually in keeping things going as those ramifications from COVID start to actually come forward. And in my mind, 2022 and into 2023 is that period where you see a greater level of economic and global instability than we've had for a while. Because the first 2 years or so of COVID-19 were very, very much around trying to respond immediately to the pandemic. You didn't sort of have the hangover, if you will, of what we did because of COVID-19, and that's only really started to emerge now. And so I think, the difficulty when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, when we look at the difficulties and the lockdowns in China, we look at those geopolitical sort of upheavals in parts of Asia, particularly in Sri Lanka at the moment. Pakistan is currently going through, a constitutional crisis. There is all sorts moving about. And so I think, as we look forward, New Zealand has a huge interest in our own backyard across the Asia Pacific, but we've got to be, I think, even more forthright now that we are starting to unlock, we're starting to reintegrate with the world, because those effects, how other countries are moving, will have big implications. We'll continue to monitor that, what, like Gareth mentioned, happens to inflation given all of this turmoil, and what other changes we might see around the globe on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.